Welcome back. It is Friday, the 6th of January. Wow, time's flying, isn't it? It's almost the end of the world, but not yet. We're going to continue our causes of the Civil War, and we're going to start briefly with the Wilmot Proviso. You don't remember the Wilmot Proviso?
I do.
Now you do.
Yeah.
Any questions, Wilmot Proviso? Yeah.
So was it like law or was it just a suggestion?
It was a attachment to a funding for the war, for the, like a funding a tax bill, Mexican War, and it wasn't approved because the South really complained about it, and the Senate is controlled by the South. Basically, it's part of the results of the Mexican War. They tried to ban slavery. And again, it's a manifestation of the abolitionist movement and the non-expansion of slavery people. It will relate to the free soilers. The Wilmot people are going to be free soil advocates. And again, that means that no slavery is going to be in the new territories. Don't expand slavery because they want to expand white opportunity, essentially. It is not approved. That leads us to the results of the Mexican War and the gold rush. California in 1850 is ready to come into the Union. It has enough population. But if they come into the Union, that will break up the balance of power in the Senate over slavery. Remember, the House is already anti-slavery. It's already dominated by the North. So the South has to maintain this balance of power. So they resist the admission of California as a slave state, as a free state, excuse me. Okay? So Henry Clay comes up with this compromise called the Compromise of 1850. And he also calls it the Omnibus Bill. You remember what an omnibus is? Do you remember an omnibus? I thought I showed you a picture of it. An omnibus is a giant, mass transit thing of the 19th century. It was like a giant carriage or like a railroad car that was pulled through the streets, a double-decker with horses. It's kind of cool. Used in the cities. But what's significant about the omnibus bill is that all of these parts were included in it. All of these parts were included in it. And it was controversial. The South and John C. Calhoun come out against California coming into the Union, saying, if you put California in the Union as a free state, that's going to disrupt the balance, and that's going to lead to civil war. Because if you will not abuse the South, basically. He's arguing that the South will only be a member of the Union if they're equal partner in the Union. They don't want to be a member of the Union if they're inferior to the North. And clearly, demographics and political developments are pushing the South into an inferior status. That's why the balance of power is so big. You understand what I mean? So he's warning for that. Henry Clay creates a compromise. And these are all the compromise pieces. And so remember, for a compromise to work, one side has to get a benefit and the other side has to have a benefit. It's like a win-win. They both need to win something. If the South perceives it's losing, they won't support it. And eventually civil war is their idea. So Clay comes up with this. So each one of these relates to either pro-South or pro-North. So California comes in as a free state. Who's that benefit?
North.
That's the North. So that's a North. North. There you go. That doesn't look like an N. Anyway. Okay. Popular sovereignty in this territory here. This is the territory from Mexico that says, popular sovereignty says, we will open this territory, the people will decide slavery. The people who move to Utah or New Mexico will decide if there will be slavery there. Is that a benefit to the north or to the south?
South.
To the south. That's a benefit to the south. So now, again, remember, how does the north view it? The abolitionists hate it because it opens slavery. They hate everything that deals with slavery that's not end slavery today. The anti-expansionists, the Wilmot people, they hate it. No, it's against the, whatever we're fighting for. What do the people who don't care say?
Don't care.
We don't care.
We don't care.
They don't care. Fugitive slave law says slaves running into the north, if any people who aid the slaves can be prosecuted, there's more money for like marshals and enforcement. Who's that aimed at? The South. That's a benefit for the South. What do the abolitionists say about that? They are going to hate it. There's going to be major problems in like New England where runaway slaves are basically arrested. There's going to be protests. There are going to be riots. The anti-expansion people hate it, and they kind of move a little more radical because of it. The people who don't care, don't care. Okay. And then the last one is no slave trade in Washington, D.C. Who's benefits from that?
North.
The North. And it's really, we were, the home of the American government. You remember the American government stands for freedom and liberty and justice for all. Oh, wait a minute. But we're selling slaves right under the shadow of the Capitol of the United States. So this is more propaganda than anything. But they do it. They stop selling slaves on the steps of the Capitol. That's nice of them. Okay, anyway.
For like a reason why the North would want to end slavery, just a separate reason, could it have been because most of Europe didn't have slavery anymore?
What's the question?
Could a reason for the North wanting to end slavery in America, because they really tried to end it,
The
could
North,
have been the appearance of America as viewed by
the principles,
how they're America still has slaves and we don't, a European looking at America.
right? They didn't care.
Okay.
The abolitionist movement and the anti-slavery movement is religious fundamental. It's wrong to have slaves. By this time, England had already outlawed slavery in 1820s or before.
Yeah.
And the international slave trade was outlawed also. There is a conflict. The Northerners, the abolitionists and the Republicans, like Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Chase and Seward, those guys, they will say, slavery goes against our values. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That is totally against what the whole meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution were fought. That's their argument. It's an ideology. They're going to say it goes against everything we believe in. Unfortunately, everything the South is based on that. It's a fundamental conflict. And it's part of the evolution of America. That's the kind of thing that I wanted to share with you guys this year, is that LERPS it's ups and downs in America. We start out with our ideals and our values, and we don't always match them, do we, in our behavior? But we try to get there. Eventually, that's what this whole concept is, progress. The 19th century, we're making some progress on all of these liberty, equality, and rights and popular sovereignty. It's not perfect. 20th century, we continue it. We do a lot better. But even today, we're still having these problems. And that's kind of why this Trump election is so fundamentally problematic, because it goes against the evolution of history, of progress. And you'll see, when we get to the 20th century, that's the whole story, is this right-left conflict. Here, it's about slavery and kind of finding out how we develop with race issues. But in the 20th century, it's all ideology. It's left-right. It's Democrats say government should help the environment of America for the good of the people. And the Republicans will say, well, we see the good of the people as being helped by laissez-faire and by free enterprise and by capitalism and no limits. And now, so we got the whole 20th century, we're on that progressive development. And now the 21st century, we've gone back to this, we're going back to tariffs. Nobody from the beginning of the 80s is thinking tariffs. 70s and 80s, they're saying no, free trade, globalization. And now we're got a president who's going, oh, we want to go back to the way it used to be. And that's really hard for most of the country to deal with. But anyway, so that's kind of what the 21st century is. People are so upset. They think they're making progress, and bam, we just went back. It's kind of like, look for that in the Civil War too. The abolitionists are saying, yeah, we're making progress. We're limiting slavery. It's going to die out. And then boom, they say, no, slavery is legal in every state. And they go nuts. Yeah, anyway. So what is the Southerners' response to this? So the Southerners react to the Northern criticism. And again, and this is kind of Calhoun's view, if you don't cooperate with us, we're leaving the Union. If you don't compromise with us and protect our interests too, we're leaving the Union. He says, the day may come when our Northern brethren will discover that the Southern states intend to be equals in the Union or independent of it. This is foreshadowing the war, because that's what the war is going to be about, the independence of the South. Okay. Clay makes these arguments. He says, here is our country on the verge of civil war, which everyone pretends to be anxious to avoid, yet everyone wants his own way, irrespective of the wishes of the others. So he's arguing we need compromise. Remember, he's the great compromiser. This is the last compromise he's involved in. Webster says we need compromise, we need the Union, and this is one of his most famous quotes. I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause. And he goes into 3-hour speech, right? Again, this is supporting Clay's compromise. The end result will be the compromise is not approved immediately at the time. The omnibus bill is not approved. But we get a new guy who comes on the scene. His name is Stephen Douglas. So Steve Douglas does get this passed. And it's passed separately. So it's a complicated explanation. Steve Douglas gets, instead of all of this as one giant law, he gets each piece, this piece first, and then this piece, and then this piece, and then etc. Do you understand? Yeah.
Who's signing parts of the compromise? It doesn't make sense. It can't be the Senate and it's not the House.
Well, here's the thing. All in one law, Clay tried to get this all in one big bill. But you didn't have enough votes to support all of it at once.
So where would it go?
So what you would do is, what they do is they broke up the bill into smaller pieces. And he got enough people to vote to have California enter, but basically in exchange for this. But they had to separate it out.
So there was 2 different forms in Congress. It wasn't just one
it's multiple
single
bills. Yeah. It turns into multiple bills. So there'll be one bill for California, one bill for the popular sovereignty, and one bill for the DC.
Is
Do you get
popular
it?
sovereignty still in Mexico?
Yeah, that's this territory.
It's still there, okay.
Yeah. So the point is it's a minor detail that Douglas comes in and they break up the omnibus bill and they pass it individually. So it ends up getting passed eventually, but not all at once, like Clay wanted. That's the detail. By the way, this is the last compromise Clay and Webster and Calhoun were involved in. They're all dead by 1852. Okay. Yeah. And so they say, you know, the new leader is Stephen Douglas. He's a Democrat. He's going to be a big player. Then you got Seward and you got Chase. You know, these guys are nowhere near as good as Webster, Calhoun, and Clay in terms of their power in the Senate. But Douglas does have he's got a big role. Yeah.
Hey, who's dead by 1852?
All of them. Webster, Calhoun, and Clay.
All the Warhawks?
Well, they're not Warhawks. They're not Warhawks anymore. And Webster was never a Warhawk.
What was their nickname?
The Great Triumvirate. Any questions on the fugitive slave law? You already know what it is? Go ahead, tell me what it is.
Well, I mean, it means that, like, runaway slaves that run away to the north can be recaptured and brought down back to the south.
What's different about it? Why do they need a new one?
Well, this one, so that, like, they could find people that were helping.
Right.
slaves.
It's stronger.
Yeah.
It's stronger. Good. You all got fugitive slave law? Okay, good. Uncle Tom's Cabin, really easy. 52. Again, another one of these elements. How do the abolitionists feel about it? Uncle Tom's? They love it. This is, it's wonderful document for what happens in slavery. How do the expansion people see it? They are energized by it. They go, yeah, slavery's problematic. Let's be more radical. How do the don't cares? Don't cares start to go, wow, slavery's problematic. Maybe we should care. Get it? Southerners, how do they see it? They hate us. It's remember the divide. It's the opposition or the sectional division. They say this is what they think of us, that we are so horrible, right? Very popular. Hundreds of thousands of copies are sold, but it really energizes that northern anti-slavery people. Harriet Beecher Stowe, remember that. Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is a really, really big deal. I'm gonna come back to the map in a minute. Kansas-Nebraska starts with this guy named Steve Douglas. He's known as the Little Giant. Did you remember the descriptions in the reading? He was like a bulldog. He was like very, very muscular but very short. And so you had this comparison between kind of a really fire plug, kind of a strong, like a stocky guy, and then old skinny Lincoln. They're like, what's that movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger and he has a twin brother with Danny DeVito? It's like,
I think it's just called Brothers or something like that.
yeah, twins.
It's such a
So,
It's such a funny.
Steve Douglas was the Democratic senator. He's a northerner. Where's he going to fit in here? Is he anti-expansion? Is he an abolitionist? Or is he don't care? He's a don't care. No. He's a don't care. He cares about business. So the backstory is the Kansas-Nebraska Act emerges out of a railroad bill. It tells you, and Stephen Douglas is a great politician. So think of it this way. He wants to get a railroad, transcontinental railroad, to connect California with a railroad. It's a giant, giant engineering endeavor. But he needs money. He's trying to get a bill. He's working for the railroad as a senator. Okay? So he's got to get the Senate to approve it. And guess who he needs? The South. And does the South care one bit about California and a railroad?
No. That's not part of that.
They're not making any benefits off a railroad because they send their goods overseas. They send their cotton overseas. They're not having any trade with California, and they have barely trade up here. They don't have tons of trade with them. So they don't care. So Steve Douglas thinks of a way. I got to get them interested, so I have to address their interests. And that's where he comes up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act that says, in exchange for your support in the railroad, I will support opening these territories to slavery. And so, if you look at the map now. This territory was called the Kansas, it was formerly called the Louisiana Purchase, right? This was banned for slavery in the Missouri Compromise, 1820. So what is that, 34 years ago, it was closed to slavery. Now they're opening it to slavery under popular sovereignty, meaning the people who move there decide if it's slave or free. Okay? So you think, this gets passed. What happens to the abolitionists? They go crazy like their hair's on fire. What happens to non-expansion people? They go crazy too. They are very, very hostile to this. And even the guys who don't care start to be, hey, this is problematic. This doesn't seem right. Everybody's thinking we should let slavery die out. If we don't let it spread, it dies. And now this is opening the possibility that it will live. By the way, is anybody thinking slavery is going to be there? No, not even the Southerners are really, it's not a real reality because it's not really good territory for cotton. There's tons of Indians here, and it's years and years in the future will it ever become states. So they're not, you know, their focus is, it's like a sideshow. You know. But the big deal is it causes the North to react badly or react against it.
I was just saying it's what it symbolizes, not really the territory, it's like it symbolizes
Yeah,
getting a chance.
it's the principle of it. Very good. So Steve Douglas is not a pro-slavery guy. He's a not care. And he rationally, and you see this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he explains it. He says, look, this is not good land for slavery. There's not going to be taking slaves up there, and this is, now we get a railroad. So you're making a big deal out of nothing. But the abolitionists don't see it that way. Go ahead.
What should I say? Why is popular sovereignty like the main, like, kind of
Theme?
compromisal thing here?
Because it's democracy. It's a really good argument, is to say, well, let the people who are moving there decide. It removes Congress from it because the issue is, it'll reduce the tensions if you push it over on something else.
Or wouldn't just the people say, oh, I got here first, or wouldn't it just be civil?
Well, that's what
There?
happens. But you're right, that's what it leads to. So think of it this way. We either fight in Congress or the people move there and by their numbers they decide. Douglas wants to remove the fight in Congress because that's too much tension. Let the people side eventually. And it may be problematic or maybe just peaceful decision. It'll be just a vote. He's counting on democracy to make it okay. If the people move there, then they can decide. Now, what it leads to is, we call it bleeding Kansas. People from the north, let's see, so here's the consequences. Let's go back. Let's go back to the map. The consequences are abolitionist people in the north starts funding people to go to Kansas. That's the next state that starts to develop population. People start moving. But you have abolitionist groups, Lyman Beecher, Theodore Weld and all those guys start funding northern anti-slavery people to move to Kansas. Is there anything wrong with that?
No?
No, but they're doing it for a purpose, to make this a free state, right?
Yeah.
Well, people in Missouri and in the South argued the same thing. Go to Kansas, make it a slave state, stand up for your people. So specifically, a lot of my people from Missouri went there. In Kansas and Missouri, there's a little mini civil war. A few people get killed. But that's exactly what you're talking about. That causes that tension. They removed it from Washington, D.C., and they put it in Kansas. You get it? It's called Bleeding Kansas. In Bleeding Kansas, here, let me show you one slide. Northern journalists about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Be assured, gentlemen, you are sowing the wind and you will reap the whirlwind. No man can stand in the north in that day of reckoning who plants himself on the ground of sustaining the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. It pits face to face the two opposing forces of slavery and freedom. So again, he's saying this is the tension that is caused by this. We see it in Kansas. The Whig Party is disintegrated because of Kansas-Nebraska Act. Remember this? Remember this? The Dems, the Whigs, the North, the South. When the Whig Party disintegrates as no national party, the Whigs in the South turn to the Democrats. The Whigs in the North turn to the new party, which is the Republicans. The Republican Party, which is an anti-slavery party. So you have the abolitionists, you have the Whigs who are against slavery, you even have Democrats who are against slavery, you have the know-nothings who are, don't care, you have the Free Soilers. All of these groups join the Republican Party in the North as a direct consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You have fighting, bleeding Kansas. You have a guy named John Brown. John Brown makes his name in first in Kansas. Get this, make sure you know this. Potawatomi Potawatomi. Everyone say Potawatomi? Potawatomi massacre. John Brown kills people in Kansas at a place called Potawatomi. Kills pro-slavery people. John Brown was an abolitionist, and he's one of these people. He got funding from the abolitionist groups to go to Kansas. He starts a farm, brings his family, and starts killing pro-slavery people in Kansas. And then he goes back east. And the third thing he does, he tries to start a slave rebellion in a place called Harper's Ferry in Virginia. That's 1858-59, right before the war starts. Other things in Kansas, and then I'll get your questions. There's two governments created, one in Lecompton and one in Lawrence. One government is pro-slavery and the other government is abolitionist. So just imagine, you have people settle Kansas, they're ready to be a state, and they form two separate state governments. One is pro-slave, the other is abolitionist. They send their application to Congress. There was election. The election, guess who won? The pro-slave election supposedly was won by pro-slavery people. Well, what happened was people from Missouri went into Kansas only for the election and then went back. It's like voter fraud, illegal immigration, voter fraud. So when Lecompton sends their application to the Senate tables it and doesn't agree with it because it's too much fraud, too much question of what's real. Kansas does not become a state until during the Civil War it becomes a free state. Any questions on that? Go ahead, Bryce.
Was John Brown funded by the abolitionists to kill people, or did he do it on
Yes.
his own?
He was funded to do
To
it.
kill people?
He was funded to go down to Harper's Ferry and start a slave rebellion. There's evidence that he was working with New England abolitionists. He will be a martyr for the abolitionist cause, but he's a crazy fanatic. Yeah. The Southerners, that's going to be a big thing. John Brown's raid is going to be a big thing for the Southerners to say, look, how can we live in this? They want us dead. How can we live in this union? Any questions on Kansas? You got all this stuff? So we did Potawatomi Massacre, John Brown. We did the disintegration of the Whigs, the establishment of the Republican Party, the Lecompton and Lawrence. Here's the way you want to remember this, Lawrence. During the war, you guys know Jesse James? Mm-hmm. Jesse James was part of a guerrilla warfare unit called the Quantrell's Raiders in Missouri. Jesse James is from Missouri. They go into Lawrence, Kansas, which was an abolitionist stronghold, and massacre all the men they could find, like 250 men, during the Civil War. They came in and they killed them, like basically executed them. And you know how you can remember Lawrence? Because that was the abolitionist city, and that they killed all their people during the war. No? Does that not help? Lawrence, Kansas, abolitionist. Okay, whatever. Yeah, who cares about the Ostend Manifesto? Is this important?
No.
What's the meaning of it? It says, here, I'll just circle the word Cuba.
430.
They wanted, the slave power wants to take Cuba and make it into 3 slave states. Is this important? Well, it doesn't work, so that's one detail. But why do we care about it? What does it signify? What's the meaning of it?
Balance of power, sure.
There's still the expansion of slavery ideas are out there. They wanted to even take Nicaragua as a slave state too. And they don't get it done. But so it just means, yeah, the Southerners still are pushing for expansion of slavery. Sumner Brooks affair. This is the really, really interesting story. Sumner was a New England, I think Massachusetts senator, and Brooks was a representative from South Carolina. Sumner made a speech in the Senate, and he attacked in this speech by name the uncle of Brooks, a guy named Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina. Okay? A Democrat, right? He was a Free Soil or a Whig at the time. He was an anti-slavery guy. Okay? Sumner's an abolitionist. So he goes on the floor of the Senate at the time of the Kansas, Nebraska, and then bleeding Kansas, and he's making a speech, and he says, "You, Senator Butler, I blame you for bleeding Kansas. You have a mistress, and your mistress is slavery. And you're creating all these problems by your devotion to your mistress," which is a personal attack on the Senate and insulting his wife by publicly saying you have a mistress and implying, you know what that implies, the sexual exploitation of slaves, right? And all these are to get messages that are sent in this argument. So it's a totally insulting thing to say. Butler kind of downplays it, you know. But Brooks, his nephew, was a congressman. And after the speech, he comes from the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is right over there, and the Senate is in the same building. Huh? It's across the hall. So Brooks walks out of the House of Representatives, and he comes over to the Senate. And Sumner is sitting at his desk. And the desks were attached to the floor, and Brooks comes up to Sumner and he starts whack, whack. He starts beating the hell out of him. He rips the desk apart, falls to the floor, brain damaged. He got brain damage from the beating. He had to leave the Senate for 3 years. He comes back during the war. And this is the picture of, this is the political cartoon of it. This is Brooks. This is Brooks. This is Sumner. Whose perspective is this showing?
Sumner's.
It's the northern perspective. Who's the villain here? Brooks is the evil perpetrator, and who's the virtuous victim? Sumner. Doesn't he look like, oh, he's holding his pen. The pen is mightier than the sword, you know. He's a martyr. He's a victim. Meanwhile, the Southerners are looking on, laughing. This is a propaganda. Make sure you pay attention to the perspectives on these cartoons. Sumner Brooks affair. So what is it symbolic of? The tensions are violent now. Even people started carrying guns in the Senate. the senators started carrying weapons for their personal protection. It's kind of like today. Oh wait, are they? No, I guess they can't do it. No, they shouldn't. Yeah. There's John Brown. These are 2 questions we're coming to now. The Dred Scott case. Dred Scott case, probably again, one of the most important developments in this era. Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. His owner was a doctor in the military, in the army. He was stationed in Wisconsin and Illinois, and he took Dred Scott with him. The doctor dies. He goes back to Missouri, he dies, and Dred Scott his ownership is transferred to, I think, his daughter or niece or something. And so Dred Scott got involved with some abolitionists, and he decided to sue in court for his freedom. Because he was, his master died and he was being transferred property, possession, whatever. He goes to court, and Judge Taney, Roger Taney, remember, Democrat, Jackson, advisor appointed by Jackson to the Supreme Court. He's pro states' rights. He's pro slavery. He's in favor of opening opportunity for the common man. Remember the Bridge case, Warren Bridge case. So Taney rules, and this is really one of the most important rulings of the 19th century. Number 1, Dred Scott was a slave. He was black. He is not a citizen. Blacks are not citizens, nor could you ever be a citizen. Therefore, you cannot even bring a case in federal court. So that's 1. 2, just because a slave is taken to a free state does not mean that slave is free. The Constitution says, the fugitive slave clause, remember that? It says if you run away to another state, you're still a slave, and you have the property owner has their rights. So just because you're a slave and you're brought to a free state doesn't mean you're free. Thirdly, the Fourth Amendment protects property. So the government cannot take your property unless they have a court order, a third party. Do you know that? They can't just keep your property. They have to have a due process. So therefore, that's another reason why you can take slaves into any state and still own them. So essentially, the Dred Scott decision, even if it's a free state, you can still take your property to any state legally and without losing your property. So basically, it almost nullifies anti-slave laws. At least that's the principle of this. Dred Scott strengthened and expanded slave owners' rights. Now, think about, how does the North react to Dred Scott? Outraged. Outraged. That's going to mobilize the North to vote Republican to stop the slave power. The rejection of all slavery-related compromise, now slavery could take place in the free states. Taney Court, remember that. Oh, there's Lincoln. Okay, now, Lincoln's response. This is where Lincoln really comes on the scene and starts to become a big player. Lincoln's response. Let's look at this. We still have time, perfect. He says, I will tell you here that General Jackson once said, each man is bound to support the Constitution as he understood it. Now Judge Douglas, this is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now Judge Douglas understands the Constitution according to the Dred Scott decision, and he is bound to support it as he understands it. I understand it another way, therefore I am bound to support it in the way I understand it. Lincoln believed, this is his ruling, exceptionally and plainly founded on error, at variance with all precedents, and not at all settled. How do you How do you overturn a Supreme Court case?
You don't.
You do.
Oh, appeal
There's
court?
two ways. There's two ways to overturn a constitution. A Supreme Court case. Go ahead.
You prove it's unconstitutional.
Another case. How do you prove it in another case?
Another.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
that's how you prove it.
It would be a
But it
civil
can't be
case.
the same.
No,
You.
no, it just has to be the same concept. You're thinking double. Okay, stop for a second. So you have two ways to remove a Supreme Court case. One way is, so you have a case in 1858, you have another case in 1868. Just like the Roe v. Wade. The Roe v. Wade was here, they'll have another one that overturns it here if you have the right judge. And that cancels this one out. Do you get it? Okay? So that's one, is another case. Supreme Court case. What's the second way to overturn a Supreme Court case?
Appellate court?
No, it's called a constitutional amendment. You amend the Constitution. For example, the Dred Scott decision is like 1858. I think. What overturns the Dred Scott decision?
57.
The 13th Amendment that ends slavery. Get it? So, what Lincoln is saying here, this case is founded on error. Therefore, we know that the court that made it has often overruled its own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this. This is the plan. For this, the strategy for the moderates in the North will be, we're going to win elective power, and then we're going to overturn this case with another case when we have a new court. That's the same thing that the conservative Republicans who hate abortion are doing. They win the presidency now. Trump's going to put people on the court that will see the Constitution as he sees it. I hope not, but or as Republicans see it. Does that make sense? And then they'll put a new case or a constitutional amendment. At least that's what the Democrats are afraid of. But here's an example, the same thing going on. The Southerners are not dumb. The Southerners see this. The Southerners know if the Republicans dominate the court or the country, they're going to put judges on the Supreme Court to overturn this, or they're going to change the Constitution. The Southerners will see with the election of 1860, the handwriting on the wall is that their power is diminished and that this new power is growing and going to dominate. At least that's what they think. And that's going to be why they leave.